All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. Thank you, GCFI, for the invitation, and thank you for the government of the Bahamas for hosting us. It is my first time in the Bahamas, and it is wonderful. I'm really excited to be here. So let's see. When I got invited to give this keynote, I was thinking, why this theme? Why this theme of linking science and society for sustainable fisheries? Why now? Why is it important to think about that, right now, in the current times? My answer to that question is that we're facing these co-occurring crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and a range of social issues, including social inequality. These co-occurring crises often lead to high vulnerability across the world. And I think we're all aware that the Caribbean is one of those really, really vulnerable regions, specifically in terms of threats from climate change. In the few conversations I've had since I arrived here in the Bahamas, I think there is also some alignment in those concerns that I have with the board of GCFI and the few people I've talked to as well. As Martin said in the opening remarks, the world is changing. It's changing really, really fast. And those links between science and society are the ways in which we're going to be able to achieve and address and overcome some of those challenges to achieve sustainability. And yes, I agree, sustainability is a term that needs defining. And hopefully we'll get to that later in the talk. I also want to acknowledge in this sort of opening remarks of change that these speak to very specific threats. We speak to environmental threats in particular, but the world is also facing a range of other threats: economic, political, social. We're facing serious humanitarian crises. Personally, I came here from Panama, where I'm from and where I live. I came via DC. But I left on Thursday, and we're in the middle of a second week of mass protests against a big mining company. And that also means second week of online school for my kids, again. And of course, lots of people, there's a lack of gas, there's a lack of fuel, there's a lack of food in some communities because of the closures. All this to say, and Panama's not the only country in the region that's facing these things. So now, more than ever, I really ask myself, how can we bring science and society together for a more sustainable future? And as part of this reflection, I think about my why. Not only how can I do it, but why am I doing this work? Why are we all doing this work? And this why is a personal journey. It's often a very personal journey that I'm going to share with you very, very briefly to sort of give a background on why and how I became interested in social science and what that looks like for me. The rest of the talk will focus more on the how and some tangible ideas and actions that we can move forward. So I want to start with my why, and this might hit differently for different folks. Definitely for early career folks in the room, I think it's a really important thing to consider and to reflect on. What is our why? I'm a social scientist, and as you'll see in a minute, I'll say how I came to social science very early in my career. As a social scientist, I study people, and as a marine environmental social scientist, I study the relationship between people and the environment that they depend on. And I'm sure that's why we're all here. This is the kind of work that we all do. It's very applied. And fisheries is a perfect example of that link between people and their environment. However, we all approach this field or this area or this area of engagement differently through our own personal journeys. My personal journey, both in interest and my professional and academic experiences, have convinced me that this is the kind of work that we need to do now to better understand how to support both people and nature. Maybe things are changing now, but certainly when I started in this field about 20 years ago, it wasn't clear how I, as a social scientist, would be able to engage in this space. In fact, I think this is my first GCFI, and I was just speaking to someone how it always felt like I didn't quite belong. As a social scientist, this wasn't a space that I felt was for me. I felt I needed to understand fish, and I needed to understand ecosystems, and it was something that was not where my degree was taking me. So, at least when I started 20 years ago, the focus was on science, and science meant nature, and it was a nature where people and society weren't necessarily included. So as I said, I came to social science early in my life. This is a picture of me, clearly on a horse with my mom, heading up to the mountains in central Panama. I'm not going to say how long ago, but precisely as part of the work that my mom's organization was doing to try to stop a mining company at the time. And so ironically, here we are, X number of years later, still continuing that fight against mining. That particular mine that we went to did not go ahead, but another mine has gone ahead. So very much like today, a mining company was threatening the livelihoods and the environments of indigenous territories in central Panama. And I'm not going to get into the details of the ongoing situation in Panama, but it's definitely a unique moment in time for my country in particular to think about the role of social movements, social protests, and how that is making a difference in these things. And these are the kinds of things that I study as a social scientist. The mining was definitely not part of my initial talking points for this talk, but I think it's a really interesting sort of turning point when we think about what are the levers, what are the policy levers, what are the things that we can do as a society in order to really drive change. It also doesn't feel like mining is something that is of interest necessarily to this group, but when we think about this particular copper mine, it's on the Atlantic side, on the Atlantic watershed of Panama, and any pollutants, contaminated sediments go straight into the Caribbean Sea. So it is something that ultimately is going to affect fisheries and communities. So in any case, growing up in Panama was experiences like this from a very early age, whether I wanted to or not. My parents took me out to nature very early in the morning. So a lot of time spent in nature, and this observation that it was people that are present in nature. And so despite all the efforts I did and my degrees and my work and the things, I always felt there was a separation. So and it was interesting, too, that the stories or the voices that I always heard of the people, the scientists that I looked up to, were always biologists or ecologists or natural scientists. And I was instead curious about economics and policy and political science and, how the human development. But I was always convinced that to protect nature, we needed to do more than just study species and ecosystems. We needed to really understand things like how people relate to nature. What are the uses that they have? What are the perceptions of those uses? And what tools do we have to make sure that those uses can be maintained for future generations? Next, please. Thank you. So the areas of study that I focus on are, we can kind of roughly group them into these three. And a couple natural human systems, I'm going to run through a very brief example of a research project. And I'm not here to talk about the content of that project, but more importantly to focus on the structure of that project, which really speaks to my why I do this kind of work. I do want to talk, next please, in terms of ocean governance. The areas that I focus on are marine protected areas, marine conservation, really looking at the enabling conditions for successful both social and ecological outcomes. I also look at questions of the blue economy. I have a PhD student right now through Oregon State who is looking at policy coherence, so the links between existing policies, fisheries specifically, and the goals of a blue economy. And I also think about equity in ocean governance, and I'll get to that also towards the end of the talk. Next, please. And the third sort of broad area, disciplines that I look at is these links between human development, environmental policy, and social environmental change. And this is one that's directly related to my work in the Caribbean, where I did my PhD in Panama, in Bocas del Toro, on the northwest coast of Panama, where we looked at the impact, the social environmental change of lifestyle migration. And by lifestyle migration, we mean the sort of influx of new forms of residence, so demographic change on an island ecosystem, which is a really interesting study at the time, and also thinking about marine and land use policy and how the integration of the two, another one of those things that we tend to separate, the land and the ocean, how the impacts of land tenure on land are really important as well for ocean outcomes. Next, please. So I'd like to run through, and next as well, I'd like to run through very briefly an example of a project that I'm still part of. It's funded by NOAA and NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, the Lenfest Ocean Program, and California's Ocean Protection Council. And it really speaks to my why. So between 2007 and 2008, there was a mass mortality event at one of the hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest. This was important because they're one of the main oyster seed producers for the United States. And this event economically impacted the fishers or the growers in the location, as well as the supply of oysters across the country. This crisis unleashed a unique response where end users, so shellfish farmers, and government, both state and federal, and end users all got together to try to understand the culprit, the driver of this mass mortality event, and to try to do something about it. And the end result was that it was ocean acidification and hypoxia were really affecting the early stages of shellfish growing, and how to do that, or how to overcome that challenge, was something that unleashed a decade of research and monitoring and significant funding from the government to address this. And so I'm part of a project that received some of this additional funding. And I want to talk a little bit about the structure of that project, right? So the first step was this biophysical vulnerability, understanding the ecological, the physical, the oceanographic component of what was happening. And this is our data team, who we're calling it, and it's our colleagues from UC Davis and UC Santa Cruz. What that team is doing is collecting every single publicly available data set along the US West Coast and related to, obviously, temperature, pH, and hypoxia. We have over 13 million data points that they've analyzed and put together into a map to tell us where these environmental conditions are changing. The catch here is that about half of those data points are more than a mile offshore. So this is where things are occurring in the ocean, but they're not occurring where people are actually growing these oysters. So then the second part of the project is the social vulnerability, which is led by my team at OSU and San Diego State. And what we're doing there is we're interviewed every single shellfish farmer between Oregon and California to identify their perceptions of change, to be able to compare those perceptions of change with the data that we were seeing, the observations, and as well to understand what strategies they were using to adapt to these changing ocean conditions. Then the third piece, also led at OSU by my colleague Erica Walters, is looking at the alignment between the policies related to ocean acidification, the policies related to aquaculture, and how those align or not with the strategies that the folks were telling us. So when you think about the structure, it is a fully interdisciplinary project that is ultimately trying to understand what opportunities exist for both species and people to adapt to changing ocean conditions and ultimately build resilience for these coastal communities. Next, please. So key takeaways from this project, and again, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to explain further at other points during the conference. But importantly, back to my why, the key takeaways for this project were it was interdisciplinary, and it allowed for really interesting, innovative questions, like as a part of a team. We just were constantly learning from each other and figuring out what were these interdisciplinary questions that we could answer that I could never answer if I was just doing interviews. And the data group could certainly not just answer if they were not including folks who were doing interviews. The other part was the partnerships. As core part of the team, so on the grant, we had the California Ocean Science Trust, which is a boundary spanning organization, and they were doing that job of connecting communities and connecting policymakers with the science we were generating, as well as government and end users, also PIs, government representatives, state representatives were PIs on the project. And then we had a very involved advisory board that included end users, such as industry partners, government agencies, and things like that. And then finally, the big why for me that is essential to the work that I do, why I do what I'm doing, is the partnerships and who I'm working with, and really thinking about what is the right combination. So when I say I'm a social scientist, I do social science, Eric does a different kind of social science, Manoj does a different kind of social science, we all do, we're all in our different fields. And it's very important to recognize what kind of knowledge, what kind of information is important to be included in the kind of research teams that you're trying to form. We're also very flexible and fluid, and communication is really, really important as part of that team formation. We also had a team agreement, so that's the logistical part of the work, but it really helped as well as we navigated these ongoing flexible, fluid things. The project started we finished writing the project in April 2020, and so conducted the whole project in the heart of the pandemic. So it was a very important part of that. So Importantly, about what the why part as well, is the importance of considering that broader scientific and political economic context in the work that we're doing, and that's where you build in that flexibility. So that's my why, and I invite you all to think about your whys in the work that you're doing. And sorry if that was a little bit longer than I had planned, but I think it's a really important foundational piece of why we do what we do. Next, please. So now I want to talk about the how we do it. And this is another one of those sort of, I think I would say life-changing collaborations. This is a paper we published earlier this year. It's called Engaging the Tropical Majority to Make Ocean Governance and Science More Equitable and Effective. The origins of this paper were in a conversation I had with my colleagues here at the Smithsonian. And the idea for this was to think about what the main pressing challenges were in the tropics related to oceans. It was driven by an interest to participate in the Our Oceans conference that happened earlier in Panama this year, and the convening happened the year before. So we were really thinking about what are some high-level messages we can take about the science, right? And I'll make clear that was, and when we talked about science, we talked about nature, right? What are the conditions? What's going on in the environment across the tropics? So I'm going to start with what is the tropical majority. So it's a concept developed by John Currian, and for our paper, we globally, we talk about the tropics as home to most of the world's biodiversity and to most of the people whose cultures and livelihoods are closely tied to and depend on healthy marine environments. We call this majority the majority of directly ocean-dependent people. And next, please. And this graph shows us 3 different ways in which we characterize the tropical majority. First way, so in our A, is through population. So it is the majority of tropical nations that have 90 to 100% of the population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. So that's clear. There are other characteristics of the tropical majority as well. The age structure of the demographics is typically a younger population. It's also an emerging market. So there are lots of characteristics, lots of ways of characterizing this. Another way is on our panel B on the left is territories under colonial rule, recognizing that there are historical legacies of colonialism. There are very different ways in which these are, thank you. There are different ways in which these histories of colonialism have manifested, the ways in which they're represented, time frames, right? I mean, there's very vast range of differences. But it's, again, really important to see that there is a shared history of colonial legacies that have an important influence on the outcomes that we're seeing today, both for people and for nature. And the third one is more related to environment, right? Spatial coverage, just on spatial coverage of marine protected areas. Most of the protected area coverage, just spatial, not talking about impacts or levels of protection or stages of establishment, but most of them are located within the tropics. And a perfect example of this is another paper we published, I think earlier this year as well, maybe late last year, on the largest 50 MPAs in the United States. Of those, 98% are in the Pacific. So only 2% of large MPAs in the United States are in the continental United States. So that tells us a lot about where we place conservation areas, where we like to place conservation areas, versus where certain populations are located. So that's the definition of the tropical majority, and for the process of writing this paper was also really important. We convened a group of 25 natural and social science colleagues that either lived in, are from, or work across the tropics. Pictured here is just a subgroup of that population that came together in Panama in October 2022. With the goal of supporting and engaging, as I said earlier, with a critical agenda setting and ocean commitment making. Specifically at the time was for our ocean, but we ended up changing the tone a little bit to reflect all the global governance fora and spaces in which this conversation is important to bring in. We intentionally invited folks from across the tropical regions, US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And we also intentionally included folks that represented a balanced mix of disciplinary backgrounds, natural, physical, and social science, a balanced mix of career stages, so all from early career all the way to more senior, and as well gender representation. It was also important that we had people who had applied experience as part of the team as well. During the 2 virtual sessions, we asked specifically to get input on pressing issues in the tropics. As I said earlier, we really wanted to understand, what are the challenges, what's going on, possible solutions to those issues, and pathways to activate those solutions. Really interesting findings as well, because one of the sessions had early career folks for the most part, and the other session had more senior, very, very different responses, which we sort of included as part of our design for our process for our in-person workshop. And so then we convened a subgroup of folks, and this was the subgroup of people that joined us in Panama, again, trying to make sure there was representation from the different regions. And this is where things got really interesting. During this in-person gathering, it became evident that we knew a lot about the science, right? We knew a lot about what was going on in the environment. We knew coral reefs were really, we knew corals were experiencing bleaching. We knew the temperatures of the ocean were increasing. We knew that in certain places sea levels were rising. We knew all of these things. And I'm sure you all know exactly what's going on in your regions as well. And so it was really fascinating to see how some of the leading scientists on aquatic foods, on coral reefs, on conservation, all coalesced around the idea that there were gaps in the data that tell us more specific details about these pressing issues, and that also sort of the agreement that the social aspect of this crisis, of these crises, was critical part of what we were understanding. And so for the social aspects, we started with the question, what are those similarities and differences across the global tropics? And that's where we came up with the idea of the tropical majority, of a shared experience with very different local contexts, but that it's really important to focus on. As I've shared in the earlier slide with the graphs, there was a really important shared history of colonization, and importantly, the influence of governance and science, and therefore the solutions to the problems were disproportionately and primarily coming from the temperate zone. So this was something really, we wanted to shift the conversation from a tropical crisis to a tropical opportunity. The underlying tone of those conversations we had in person was that systematic changes in inequity and access were critical to addressing the challenges we were facing. And I'm going to use a quote here from the paper, is that ultimately this severing of power, right, the separation of power between the people that were on the ground living the experiences across the global tropics from where the decisions were being made. So the severing of power, the severing of knowledge and relationship of local people with place reduces access to the ocean and related benefits, erodes or prevents local governance or limits, and hinders our ability to meet the needs and the collective ability to pursue shared goals for people and the ocean. So it was a call to action to sort of say, we know what's going on, we live here, we work here, we see what's going on. How can we reverse these conversations and enable, sort of really increase the power of the experiences and knowledge that we have? So we came up with 4 actionable solutions, tangible solutions for ocean sustainability. And I'm going to go through the 4 really briefly just to give examples of what we mean by those. So centering equity in ocean governance. One of the examples we thought about here was thinking about how we can develop and implement ocean equity commitments across scales. So for example, the Our Ocean Conference has 6 key themes. So those key themes are sustainable fisheries, blue economy, pollution, climate change, and maritime security. And one of our recommendations, and we actually had a meeting with the Department of State while they were in Panama, was to say, how can we add a commitment theme of equity? We can wordsmith, we can change it, we can call it something else. I'm just using it as a placeholder. But how do we create a theme where we can actually make commitments and we hold people accountable for those commitments that we're making? So that's an example of how we might center equity in ocean governance. Another piece is also how we ensure that accountability for past impacts as well as for future funding and benefit sharing. And this is an example of the loss and damage conversations that are happening at COP and really coming up to the forefront and the importance of those coming up in December here. Our second tangible, actionable solution is this idea of reconnecting people to the ocean. We're all connected to the ocean, right? That by definition, that's, again, why we're all here. But this one specifically had to do with legal rights and access. So part of it was, for example, reversing some large-scale coastal privatization, facilitating access to ocean resources and coastal lands, and stopping, reducing, or just questioning things, concepts such as fortress conservation, or conservation that excludes people from place. So example would be, can we think about some community-based conservation efforts? What would community-based conservation look like? A third solution is one that is particularly interesting, dear to my heart, is really changing or redefining or replacing the transactional notion of capacity building with the idea of capacity sharing. So instead of saying we need to build capacity in certain places, people need technical knowledge, recognizing that there is a lot of knowledge already in place. So can we sort of change it from here I am and educating to here I am sharing some of these experiences. Another one is sort of really recognizing the practical wisdom and local indigenous knowledge in place. So an example that was brought to us during the conference or during the meeting was thinking about the Polynesian Voyaging Society. How can we bring in the examples of voyaging or other local knowledge and experiences into what we call ocean literacy and what we are taking to our youth, to anybody that's interested in ocean issues? How do we tell the story of the ocean? And finally, we call it decolonizing, rethinking ocean science. And again, to be clear, when we talk about science, we talk about natural and social science. So for this one, it's really broadening the scope of who leads, who participates, and who benefits by developing clear protocols to make sure that scientific research programs integrate local capacity and priorities, making sure that there are equitable partnerships and opportunities that include and guarantee and include authorship. And this is particular in the app. I actually saw that there was a question, and it was about how do we incorporate gender. And this is a particularly important one around gender. We also have a paper on the key gender differences for women early career professionals in particular, and the impacts of citation and the impact of valuing metrics specifically, or publication metrics specifically, and how that can be harmful. So this is another great example of thinking about how do we redefine what we mean by ocean science? What are the metrics that we're using to say, you know, I am a successful scientist? And then finally, the scope of science has to be expanded to include the social sciences, to include the human dimensions, to include the humanities and co-production, so that we can include multiple disciplines that reflect and address the social ecological complexities of the situations that we're dealing with. So that was a really fun process. And again, to my why, I encourage you all to find those people that you really get along with, because the process of the writing that paper, I would say, is as interesting and exciting and enlightening as, to me, the final outcome. And I think that's reflected in that really amazing collaborative experience. So I'm going to start to wrap up and talk about another how, and this is something that I'm doing now. As Eric mentioned, I'm currently the director of the Adrian Arsht Community-Based Resilient Solutions Initiative. That's a mouthful. And I am based at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, but it is a Smithsonian-wide initiative that falls under the umbrella of a new program or vision for how the Smithsonian does science called Life on a Sustainable Planet. LSP was launched last year at COP, and this year at COP we're going to launch the Ocean Strategy for Life on a Sustainable Planet, under which the Resilience Center falls. The theme for the Resilience Center, or Resilience Initiative, is adaptation as a pathway to resilience. So where adaptation, we define it as the ability to cope with or respond to change, and change is an inherent trait of an organism or of a policy or of a governance or of human societies, right? So change is both social and ecological, and where resilience is that adaptive outcome. And importantly, when we think about resilience as an adaptive outcome, we really want to focus on it as a desired adaptive outcome, like who is defining what that resilient outcome is and what we want to see. And it's also a dynamic concept. So a resilient outcome may be resilient today, but with the rate of change, we're obviously going to maybe want to have a different outcome in the future. Ultimately, the goal for the center is for it to be precisely the theme of this conference. It's the integration of science and society, and it's thinking about how we move that forward, how we move the science, how we move the research, how we move the engagement, and how we move the solutions using these key concepts. The structure, probably less important to all of you, but for me as director is really important, is really thinking it's going to be based at STRI, as I said, in Panama, but looking across all Smithsonian units, starting with the Smithsonian research units, which include CERC. Some of you are probably familiar with CERC, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, as well as the Natural Museum of Natural History, STRI, the Air and Space Museum, and other research units across the Smithsonian. It is strategically located at STRI, and I think this is why it's a really great opportunity to connect with GCFI. STRI has been in Panama for over 100 years, and we have multiple facilities across 2 different oceans, as well as terrestrial forest ecosystems. And importantly, I don't know how much you all know about STRI, but the key piece as I come into this now is thinking about the next 100 years and how can we make the science and the way we do science and the approach a new way of doing things. And my role in particular is really building that structure for the center moving forward. So initially, the center we have focused on fellowships. So we launched the Smithsonian Resilience and Sustainability Fellowship in 2023. We still have not made decisions on those in case there are any applicants out there. We're working on that. And the idea is that that's going to be in collaboration with DC-based climate change and environmental justice fellows. All 3 of these fellowships are brand new efforts for the Smithsonian and are really ways to push forward some of these ideas that I've been mentioning and it's in a collaboration with new leadership and new thinking around how we do things. The second piece is convening, so that tropical majority convening that I shared is an example. I'm proposing to maybe do 2024 as a year of oceans and society, where all our programming would be around that theme. So I invite you all to stay tuned. The third piece is education, and this is a really fun one. We're working with the Smithsonian Environmental Education Center, SSEC, and we're focusing on developing diverse stories, videos, K-12 modules, and teacher training. So the idea really is to launch this idea of resilience at all levels, starting with education and moving through into research, education, or research solutions, et cetera. And then finally, what is the vision for the future center? Our vision for the center is to focus on these 4 pillars, focusing on research, which hopefully includes things like what all of you are doing, as well as the research that I talked about and really driven by some of these new innovative fellowships that we're promoting. Engagement T. In engagement, we're thinking about things like an extension program. What are some of the lessons we can learn from all the applied work that you all are doing, that folks are doing? How can we really take the science to the communities and make sure that the science is driven by what the needs of communities or end users are? Solutions would be the outcome of some of that science, and thinking about how do we then come up with actionable solutions, and training is these fellowships. It's really thinking, do we focus on a fellowship program? Do we focus on youth? Do we focus on building a global tropics center for engaging the next generation of tropical majority leaders, right? This is all in the works, and again, I welcome your thoughts on how to do that, but this is sort of just wanted to give you a glimpse into what we're thinking about. Cross-cutting themes are really important to this. Linking science and society are transdisciplinarity, youth-inspired, and always centering equity in everything we do. Thank you.